Okay, well, welcome to the Holy Church of the great god Psyche. She is everywhere. Now and I are merely her prophets. So now just ask me to give an introduction to some philosophical issues about Panpsychism. So I thought that's what I do. Just the view, some reasons for believing it, and some of the problems for the view. So use the old-fashioned method of whiteboard here. Oops! The whiteboard is, let's see how the red. Red seems somehow more appropriate for a talk on Panpsychism. So Panpsychism divides into two parts. There's the Pan, and there's the Psychism. Pan is for all, and Psych is for mind. So, all mind, everything has a mind. Now you get different versions of the view depending on exactly how you understand these two halves. The all and the mind. I mean, the most extreme version of Panpsychism says that absolutely everything has a mind. Rocks have mind, pens have mind, the universe has a mind, but not just this. The number two, an abstract object, has a mind. The sum of this church and some other church on the other half of the universe, other side of the universe, has a mind. And so most panpsychists are not traditionally committed to such a strong view. Perhaps closer to the core of the traditional view is that fundamental physical entities have minds. So quarks and photons and electrons have minds. Many people who've called themselves panpsychists have wanted to embrace that claim while denying that rocks and pens have minds. Maybe systems have to have a certain degree of integration or unity, for example, to have a mind. So closer to the core of the traditional view is that fundamental physical entities have minds. Sometimes the view gets used in a looser way, so that even if you're fairly liberal about ascribing minds or consciousness, you're a panpsychist. So maybe someone who believes that cells have minds, for example, it could be counted a panpsychist in a certain sense, whether or not they think that fundamental particles have minds. So I guess maybe we'll be looking at some views in this vicinity. At the workshop, talking about the possibility of minds in plants and bees and machines without necessarily going all the way down. But I guess the core of the traditional view is that there's some kind of mentality at the fundamental level of the physical universe, and at least in some other systems, including human beings. So that's the all side of panpsychism. You get a bit of a breakdown in different dimensions there. What about the mind side? Well, there's different things you can mean by having a mind. Sometimes panpsychism is parodied as supposing that, electrons are having complicated streams of consciousness and thinking and reasoning and getting really bored because they're always having to stay in orbit around these nuclei and so on. I mean, the core of the traditional view, I think, is that fundamental systems have some kind of conscious experience, some raw, subjective experience, probably more analogous to the kind of very simple experience we have, say, in perception, like, say, red versus blue, hot versus cold, than like the kind of experience we have when thinking and reasoning. But one can certainly get different kinds of panpsychism on different dimensions here. And the view that everything can think, the view that everything can feel, but I think the traditional view is closer to the view that everything can feel or have some kind of experience. But maybe it's worth, as we go forward over the next day and a half, thinking about just what kind of claims are being made. For example, with a plant, is the claim being made that plants and bees have some kind of cognition, some kind of intelligent behavior, which is very much, in some sense mental, but a third-person characterizable phenomenon, or is the claim being made that they have some kind of subjective experience? Again, in the context of ASSC, I guess the primary phenomenon is consciousness. And here I understand consciousness as raw subjective experience. There's something it's like to be the system. So I guess the core claim of traditional panpsychism might be that there's in fact something it is like to be an electron or a photon or a quark and so on. Of course, then the next question is, what is it like to be an electron or a photon or a quark? I did actually read a paper recently in a philosophy journal with just that title, what is it like to be a quark? As far as I can tell, no one's actually got a good answer to that question, but if anyone can answer that question in the next day or two, I'll be very happy. Maybe IIT has an answer. Actually, I think IIT, maybe quarks don't end up quite being conscious because you need two units to be conscious. Close enough. Also worth mentioning here is a view that sometimes gets called, so that view that everything has a mind, fundamentalities of a mind, is sometimes, as now said, called Pan experientialism. Sorry, the view that everything is conscious in the sense that there's something it's like to be the system, is sometimes called Pan experientialism to distinguish it from other kinds. Maybe it'll be our central focus here, but I think, probably there'll be Pan cognition as a different view. Everything has some kind of cognition distinct from consciousness. Worth mentioning also is Pan Psychism, which is roughly the view that everything has a proto-mind, or everything has proto-experience. What is proto-experience? Well, the thought is it's a primitive precursor to experience that is somehow sort of special in some interesting ways, such that you put enough of this proto-experience together and it gives you experience, but it's not a self-experiential. This view has the advantage of not having to assert crazy-sounding claims like there is in fact something it's like to be a quark. They can say, well, there's not anything it's like to be a quark, but quarks have this primitive precursor to consciousness, and you put together enough of this in the right way, and you'll get consciousness. So this view has also been fairly popular in recent years, and often the people who are sympathetic with mine also have some sympathy with the other.
So would IIT be categorized as a Panpsychism in your?
I think you have to ask that one to Julio.
No, that's for you.
What's it?
That's for you.
What's that? Well, I mean, you deny that quarks are conscious, right, on their own. Single units.
A single unit would not.
Single units, no consciousness. So strictly speaking, no consciousness at the single unit level. But this is more on the all side. I think 2 units of the right kind can be conscious. And my view is, Julio does not say it's proto-experience. I think he says it's real, straight-out experience for the 2-unit system. So nothing particularly proto. Oh, the question is, would single units have proto-experience?
So
interesting
would
question.
be unconscious, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
But do they have some special proto-experience? That's a question for Julio.
No, the answer is no. So we will discuss this, but there is no point in my mind of assuming this proto nature, which is neither fish nor point.
Yeah.
And hoping that you can get something out of that at any price.
Yeah.
This is why we're defining terms and understanding them. When people say consciousness can't come out of nothing, IIT would be saying it actually can come from the coupling of two parts.
We'll talk about that. But maybe not. Because I need to sort of be able to demonstrate some simple examples so it becomes clear. I think it would be good if to sort of illustrate these various options before we try to narrow down what is where does IIT lie in the specification.
Any other questions about the definitions, about what counts as panpsychism? I think, yes.
I have one general question in the sort of history of all of this. In terms of now's question of units, which I think is actually quite interesting, is that something that's addressed in terms of that if someone says, that the rocks are conscious and wood is conscious and this church is conscious and another church is conscious and everything's conscious, does that infer, is the general view across all of these things that there's therefore like infinite levels of consciousness in anything? Like this church has just infinite levels of consciousness depending exactly where you are looking, or they just it's not really discussed?
I think you'll find massive variability on that question. David Scribner's book, Panpsychism in the West, is worth looking at because he looks at any number of panpsychists across the history of philosophy and science. The core, I think, is that there is consciousness at the basic level, and there's also consciousness in humans. And then some panpsychists will say consciousness literally everywhere, at every level, but I think quite a lot of people want to impose some kind of strong unity or integrity condition. So that many panpsychists are at pains to deny, for example, that rocks have consciousness. They're always accused of believing that rocks are conscious, and Galen Strawson says, I don't think rocks are conscious because they don't have the right kind of integrity or unity. And if you took that kind of view, you might think it only happens in very special systems. but I think that varies a lot across the tradition. Whitehead was a process philosopher, thought that basically any kind of process has some degree of experience, and he might be closer to the infinite levels here. Yeah.
Yeah, why not? Why do we have this now? Is there a rekindling of interest in panpsychism? Is it you? Is it,
Absolutely.
Is it your interest? Is it your... Are the crypto-panpsychists everywhere? Are we the crypto-panpsychists?
We are it. No, actually, it is a bit amazing that over the last few years there's been an extraordinary growth of interest, both coming somewhat independently from the philosophy and from the science. I mean, on the empirical side, it's been really interesting to see interest driven by empirical theories of consciousness, like IIT, which have been, driven by the science, but seem to have at least, implications in the direction of panpsychism. I mean, the hammer of Penrose theory is another. And at the same time, philosophers thinking about the mind-body problem have been moved to views on which, if you move towards views where consciousness is fundamental, say as I am, and irreducible, if you move by things like the hard problem of consciousness. And the next question is, where does it fit into nature? And we've got these two alternatives, roughly, which are dualism. Consciousness is somehow separate, a fundamental thing, quite separate from the physical world, which raises the question of how do you integrate it with the physical world, or roughly the panpsychism, that consciousness is present at the very bottom of the physical world. And I think quite a lot of philosophers in recent years have been driven to explore panpsychism to avoid those particular costs of dualism. And in fact, over the last 5 years, I've been to about, this is probably the 4th or 5th conference on panpsychism I've been to, but the first one, I think, which is really grounded in the science rather than the philosophy. 2 years ago, we had a conference actually here in Queensland on, are we still in Queensland? We are, aren't we? On the Great Barrier Reef, on Lady Elliot Island. We had a workshop just on the combination problem for panpsychism to see if we were either going to solve the problem or prove it couldn't be solved. Didn't quite do either, but we made some progress. But no, I think there's actually been a lot of younger philosophers in the younger generation, especially, who've been really driven towards this view. And then, with this interest coming from science, it's really quite an interesting and surprising development. Okay, but that plays into the next question, which is what are the reasons to believe panpsychism? I mean, it is initially a counterintuitive view for many of us, but I believe this crazy view. And I think for a lot of people in philosophy, some of the motivation at least comes from taking as a starting point the explanatory gap that consciousness is subject to, or the hard problem, that there seems to be some kind of a gap between our ordinary characterizations, at least, of the physical world in terms of structure, mathematical structure and dynamics, and raw subjective experience. And many people, including me, have been moved to think you can't wholly explain consciousness in those straight-out structural, dynamical terms. There's this gap. And that leads people to think that there's something fundamental and irreducible about consciousness. From that perspective, panpsychism, and that then immediately raises the question, how to fit consciousness within nature. What's its position in this big physical order that we have all this great scientific reason to believe in? And there's the dualist alternative where it's separate. But panpsychism offers the potential for a more integrated and continuous view of nature, more parsimonious in some respects. And I think many of the traditional arguments for panpsychism have that kind of character. Here is a place for consciousness in nature. So one traditional argument for panpsychism is just the argument from continuity, thinking about evolution. I think now go to this one. Where did consciousness actually kick in the evolutionary order and the history, indeed, of the universe? So it looks like if you're not a panpsychist, and at a certain point in evolutionary history, it just needs to somehow click on. And now we're used to some many phenomena just developing at a certain point in the evolutionary order, like complicated learning, vision presumably started at a certain point and so on. But against the background where consciousness is viewed as this special, fundamental, and irreducible thing, it becomes kind of hard to see how it's going to just click in at a certain point in the natural order. And it requires, I think, what now is calling a certain kind of brute emergence. It's like, well, suddenly you've got something out of nothing. It's like when you reach a certain degree of complexity, then bing, consciousness clicks in, maybe that could work. You know, maybe it's a fundamental law of nature that when phi is greater than 100, then you get consciousness or something. But a lot of people have found that kind of emergence mysterious. So one of the traditional arguments for taking panpsychism seriously is, well, if consciousness was there all along, you can avoid that magical emergence. Somehow maybe consciousness on this view was present even at the Big Bang, and what's happened rather is just that consciousness has somehow got organized and differentiated and integrated, and as the physical systems have evolved to be more complex and coherent and unified and sophisticated, likewise so has the consciousness. So that's one way of motivating panpsychism, through continuity. Another traditional argument in philosophy is the argument from intrinsic natures of things. And here you get the idea that physics and science more generally tends to characterize entities in the physical world by their relations to each other. You know, what do you learn about fundamental particles, say from classical physics? Basically how they interact. There's laws of gravitation that says that these masses attract each other in such a way, the laws of mechanics that say that these masses resist acceleration in such and such a way. It's a big network of interaction of entities and forces. But it never actually, you know, some people will be moved to say, physics doesn't actually tell us what these things are like in themselves. They're intrinsic natures. Everything is characterized either by its effects on us or its effects on other things. It's a giant structural network. You might want to say, well, you know, what is mass in itself? What is an electron's intrinsic properties? And some philosophers, at least, have been moved to think there must be such intrinsic properties. They say, well, science never tells us about these intrinsic properties in nature. And then people say, what intrinsic properties, in fact, do we know about? You know, the properties that things have in themselves, not in virtue of relations to other things. And some people have been moved by the idea that consciousness is such an intrinsic property. We know about the intrinsic properties of consciousness. They're right here. And perhaps that those are the only intrinsic properties of things in the world that we know about. So from this direction, some people have been led to speculate that maybe, in fact, the intrinsic nature of electrons and quarks and photons that goes along with these roles they play in physics is somehow tied to consciousness. Maybe even, you know, mass or charge correspond to certain basic experiential properties at the level of the photon or the quark. I mean, you know, it's only a speculative argument. It's not any kind of conclusive argument, because maybe there are other intrinsic properties that we can't conceive. Maybe there are no intrinsic properties. But many people have been at least moved by that to think, okay, there is a natural place for consciousness at the bottom level of the physical world. After all, physics just characterizes the entities in terms of their connections, and there's a hole there. There's a hole in physics for these intrinsic properties. Maybe that could be experiential. This plays into what I think of as the third argument for panpsychism, what I'm very interested in, which is the causal argument. The question of if there is consciousness as this basic and irreducible thing, how can it play a causal role in the physical world? It sure seems like consciousness affects our behavior somehow. After all, I'm here giving a talk about consciousness, waving my arms around and saying all this stuff that seems to be a product of my consciousness. How can an irreducible consciousness play a role in the physical world? And dualism famously has all kinds of problems. It comes in two main varieties, either epiphenomenalism, where consciousness plays no causal role at all, which is at least very, very counterintuitive, that my being conscious has nothing to do with causing all this vocalizing and arm waving and so on about consciousness. Or consciousness actually plays non-physical consciousness plays a role in pushing things around in the physical world. And somehow that seems to require that it somehow interferes with physics. And many people think that physics is this closed system. That seems to be the picture that many people draw from contemporary physics. Awfully hard to see how consciousness could interfere with that without really causing physics to be, overturned or revolutionized. No, there are some ideas from the dualist here. Many people find some room in quantum mechanics for a role for non-physical consciousness, but it's a problem. The panpsychist offers the vision of of actually a causal role for consciousness at the basic level. If consciousness, if the intrinsic natures of electrons and protons and so on, quarks, actually involve consciousness, consciousness could be playing a causal role at the very basic level of nature. You know, maybe when there's gravitational attraction between two basic masses, that's actually some force that's somehow stemming from consciousness at the basic level. I mean, you know, again, it's much easier to speculate about it and to draw out the details, but the thought is that by consciousness being inside that causal network of physics at the bottom level, now it could somehow become integrated into nature. And in a paper I recently wrote called, I guess it was in the readings, Pan Psychism and Pan Psychism, I use this causal argument, which many people offer as the best reason to believe physicalism, combining that with the arguments about the heart problem, which are the best reasons to reject physicalism, saying that you can somehow see panpsychism as a middle way to handle the arguments that support physicalism, like the causal argument, as well as the arguments that support dualism, like these explanatory arguments. Maybe panpsychism can simultaneously have consciousness be fundamental and playing a causal role. So so these are all, in a sense, arguments from a place for consciousness in the physical world. The other kind of argument, though, which has become relevant quite recently, I think, is these sort of broadly empirical arguments, theoretical arguments for, let's develop a theory of consciousness that handles the data that we know about. And I think the data about consciousness in the first instance are data from human consciousness. We've got the data of subjective experience here. We've also got the data of neuroscience and psychology, and I think all of us agree we must somehow build an explanatory connection between them. What is the theory that's going to bridge the third person data with the first person data? Even if you're a dualist, you think that, okay, somehow we're going to have to connect physical processing to subjective experience. And then the question comes up, as elsewhere in science, what's the simplest, most powerful, and most unified theory that will explain the data we do have? And at least some people have been led to think that the most simplest and most powerful theories that do this will end up having broadly panpsychist views as a consequence. Now this is a very different style of argument for panpsychism in some ways. It's more indirect. It's not that panpsychism is immediately revealed by philosophical reasoning. Rather, we go to the hard work of constructing a theory and we look at its consequences and its predictions. Now take it something like this is what's going on in the case of integrated information theory. Let's develop a theory and look at its consequences. And there have been other theories too. I mentioned the Hameroff-Penrose theory and so on. But stepping back as a philosopher, one can see one reason for expecting this at least might be true. If we're going to look for the deepest connection between, say, the physical world and consciousness, I mean, a lot of people are inclined to think, well, intuitively, you need complexity to be conscious. Surely it kicks in at a certain point in the natural order. But then, if you think about it a bit more, well, complexity is never sort of primitively relevant. Complexity is something you need in order to do something. So, maybe one way to put this is, just say you think panpsychism is false. Now, of course, there's something else you think is required, X. There's some special thing, X. So you need X to be conscious. And electrons and quarks just don't have enough of X. So you can see this as a challenge that the panpsychists might issue to their opponents, the non-panpsychists. What is this special thing called X that you think you need for consciousness? Now there's any number of candidates for what X might be. But the moment you look at them, then, none of them are terribly well supported as reasons to think you absolutely need that to be conscious. So, originally a lot of people wanted to say only humans can be conscious because you need language to be conscious. But then in fact you look around and you look even at the evidence about humans and so on, it looks like there's not very much positive reason to think you need language to be conscious, and there's all kinds of at least indirect reasons for thinking that systems without language can be constant, and various kinds of aphasia don't seem to remove consciousness, and so on. So okay, that candidate's not particularly plausible. And you go down the order. Maybe you need some kind of reasoning power to be conscious. Well, why? It looks like if you look at what's going on in vision and pain and so on, it's got not very much to do with complex reasoning. So I think a lot of people now think that reasoning is much too complex to be required for consciousness. And then we just keep going, throw out candidates. Maybe I'll ask people to throw out candidates in a moment for the X that they think might be required for consciousness. Maybe you need reflection or higher order processing. Well, I think that's required for consciousness. And for all of the complex phenomena people want to throw in, it shows that there's not much in the way of empirical or philosophical reasoning for thinking that's required for consciousness. So when Giulio outlines his axioms of consciousness for IIT, here are the basic things we require for consciousness. Here are the things which are obviously required for consciousness, and he lays out his 5 axioms. It turns out there's nothing there that requires very much complexity. There's nothing obviously in the phenomenology of consciousness that requires that complexity. So it's easy to see how when looking for the simplest possible theory of consciousness, you end up looking at the processing at a very basic level. And at this point, the panpsychist the whole process is dialectical here. An opponent of panpsychism can say, well, I think you need a global workspace to be conscious, particularly complex global workspace. And then we're going to say why. What are the reasons to believe that, as opposed to the much more limited claim that in humans, this is how it works. Anyway, so that's the whole dialectic that gets you going down the theoretical routes to panpsychism. Simple, powerful theories end up having the panpsychist consequences. The alternative theories look much more ad hoc. Finally, on problems for panpsychism. Well, I guess there's a few different problems here. There's the basic problem that seems to many people to be massively counterintuitive. This is what the John Searle problem was. The John Searle objection is basically that it's absurd. David Lewis once said about an objection to a particularly radical theory of his that, the main objection to this theory that I get is an incredulous stare. And he said, I don't know how to refute an incredulous stare. I think one point we can make, though, about panpsychism is that this is very much an intuitive reaction. Intuitions about this matter vary greatly across cultures. At different points in history, in different cultures, panpsychism has been found really quite intuitive. So I think the fact that it's counterintuitive is not much of an objection, unless someone can turn that intuition into an argument. Some people have tried turning it into an argument, but it turns out to be hard work. You might take the line, and if this is a reasonable objection, there's not very much direct evidence for panpsychism. Is there strong empirical evidence for panpsychism? I have to admit, I'm not, I can't point to a whole lot of immediate positive evidence for panpsychism. I'm not going to say, hey, look at what that lecturer is doing. It's showing little signs of animism. I think it's waking up now. Maybe it's just coming out of one of those dreams. We can ask it for an electron subjective report. No, that's not how the case for panpsychism is working. But at the same time, you can also turn this objection on its head and say, is there any direct evidence against panpsychism? And here we immediately come up against the issue that direct measurements, really direct measurements of consciousness, especially in non-human systems, are awfully hard to find. The evidence about flies just doesn't indicate one way or the other, directly, whether they're conscious or not, because consciousness is private and subjective, and we don't have the old consciousness meter. So you might take a line, okay, there's no direct evidence for it, there's no direct evidence against it. The best we can do is work with indirect evidence and indirect reasoning, and for example, building theories that handle the evidence that we have, and then seeing what their predictions and consequences are. Of course, this does raise the even deeper question of how we can test the theory and falsify it, and I wish I had an answer to that question. Maybe someone here can figure that one out. Can we ever directly test panpsychism by doing an empirical measurement, or are we always going to be left in this position of offering it as the best integrated theory, somewhat speculative, that unifies all this data? If that's the position we're in right now, maybe we can do better one day, but it's not obvious how. The biggest objection to panpsychism, in my view, is what now alluded to, the combination problem. It's basically the question of, well, if panpsychism is true, the question is, what's the relationship between all those little bits of experience at the basic level and the experience that we have? It's a human consciousness. And one view, one very attractive view, is what I call constitutive panpsychism, that those little bits of consciousness at the basic level somehow add up to our consciousness. So once we really understood or the whole system of the little bits, then we can see how they would come together to form our consciousness. Now, you don't need to go that way. There's an alternative, which people sometimes call emergent panpsychism. Human minds are something new, wholly new, even with respect to the little minds. Maybe there's some basic law of nature that says when you put 5 little minds together, you get a big mind. And the big mind has a certain autonomy. The trouble is with that view, this came up in the question period after my talk the other day, is that it's not clear what the advantages now are of that view over dualism. Because although the little minds are integrated with physical processing, the big mind the human mind seems to somehow float free. It's potentially, either it's epiphenomenal, not doing any causal work, or it needs to somehow interfere with the physical processing. So emergent panpsychism seems to many people to have many of the disadvantages of dualism. If you want the integrated picture, where consciousness is really integrated with the physical world, you need this constitutive panpsychism. The little minds add up to the big mind. But then the question is, how on earth does that happen? How do the little minds combine to yield the big mind? And William James raised a version of this back in the Principles of Psychology, where he said, you can put together 100 subjects of experience. We've got 30 odd people in this room. But you've got 30 odd people in this room. Okay, this is great, it's very unified, it's very interesting. Is a 31st mind coming out of this? Well, not obviously. Maybe it's hanging around somewhere in the ceiling. But it was awfully hard to see why it is that you put together any number of subjects of experience, you should get an extra one somehow out of that. Whereas panpsychism seems to say this has to happen. Put together a billion little micro-subjects, at least if you think that these micro-experiences involve micro-subjects, and you get a macro-subject. How does that happen? So a lot of people have been led to think about this problem in recent years, and some ideas have been put forward, but nothing terribly, terribly compelling so far. I like to distinguish the combination problem for subjects, the one I just mentioned. There's also a combination problem for qualities. Human experience involves all these extremely rich qualities, the color qualities we're getting now, the sound qualities, the emotional qualities. The panpsychist view, maybe you've got maybe 7 fundamental properties at the bottom level, corresponding to mass and spin and charge. How do those 7 little qualities add up to the rich qualities of experience that we have? Furthermore, how does all that physical structure yield the structure of phenomenology, which seems so different from the physical structure? So I like to talk about the subject combination problem, the quality combination problem, and the structure combination problem. As far as I can tell, there's a few ideas floating around out there about each of them. Nothing terribly compelling so far. If it turns out we can't solve the combination problem, then it looks like either you've got to move for emergent panpsychism, which will just say somehow there's some root emergence when you put together these little minds to get the big mind out, which then takes you a bit back in the direction of dualism, or you have to give up on panpsychism entirely. Now it may be that some of these empirical theories like IIT or other views are going to have insights to offer on the combination problem. That's going to be something we'll be interested to see over the next couple of days. I have to say, in my own thinking about panpsychism, it's very much this sort of divided mind. I feel the attractions very strongly, but also the problems very strongly. And over the last year or two, I wrote a paper on the combination problem, and I'm gradually becoming convinced that it's extremely difficult to solve all of these problems at once, to see how the little bits of consciousness could add up to a conscious subject with all these qualities and all this structure. So I'm gradually becoming a little bit more skeptical about panpsychism, I'm sorry to say. But it's still early days, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing the ideas that might be put forward over the next day or two, so maybe we can solve these problems for once and for all and get the whole thing figured out. Okay, maybe time for questions.
Yeah, thank you. So we have roughly 20 minutes for questions, discussions. Yeah.
So there's a different kind of view which looks a bit like Panpsychism, but which is not strictly speaking, I think, Panpsychism, which goes back to discussions of functionalism and multiple realizability and so on. And I'm wondering if maybe the kind of Panpsychism that people try to associate with IIT is not so related to the kinds of motivation of Panpsychism that you mentioned, but simply the idea that IIT defines functional, and then we find kind of explosion of things outside our brains that can realize that in principle. But that seems to be a kind of view than the kind of view that you...
How would this lead one to panpsychism? Is the idea that, for example, somebody might say, all I mean by mind is integration. And even tiny systems do a bit of integration. Yeah, this would be a little bit like, the AI theorist John McCarthy had a version of panpsychism. He used to say even thermostats can think. Yeah, even thermostats have a little bit of intelligence, because all it is to think is some very simple form of representation. And this doesn't actually require any of the explanatory gap intuitions. It just requires a conception of mind as involving functioning. And then, most people think mind is going to require some very complex functioning. If you think, well, that complex functioning has analogs at the very simple level. It's basically a matter of response. Thermostats can represent in some weak sense. They can respond in some weak sense. Then you might be inclined to say this in mind at the basic level. Likewise, for integration of information. If you think mind is all about integration of information, and there's some very simple integration of information, you might think that's a very simple kind of mind. You're right, that's a way to motivate panpsychism, which is fairly independent of these explanatory gap intuitions. It stems from taking a very deflationary approach to the mind rather than the somewhat inflationary approach which is involved in the consciousness case.
It might be that the types of panpsychism that are interesting to science are the ones that sit with the functions side of things.
Maybe interesting, although, as a matter of fact, I think Julia, for example, has got not much sympathy with this functionalist vision, being very much driven by the phenomenological features of consciousness. And the same is true for, I think, for the Penrose version. But maybe there is, in fact, there's potentially this bifurcation. And it might even be that someone of that kind could take the kind of thing that, say, that Julia says and give it a very deflationary spin. Yeah.
I wonder about, I haven't really thought this through, but as to the combination problem, it's kind of like an integration problem in itself, like how do small things get added up into bigger things, from taking the small things as a basic level. Can it be profitable to turn that upside down and say that instead talk about it as a differentiation problem? That, your starting point is like a single aspect or a single nature to what exists, and what physics does is it causes things to differentiate and cluster in some way. And at some point you get what we call consciousness, but then it can differentiate even further where we don't recognize what it is anymore, but it's still all the same stuff. I mean, is that one of the attempts to solve? Can you solve it in that direction?
Well, I think it is absolutely an important view. Some people have recently explored a view they call Cosmopsychism, which is the whole universe is conscious. After all, people say if you look at classical physics, the fundamental entities are maybe the particles. But if you look at contemporary physics, like quantum physics, it starts to look like the fundamental entity that physics describes as the whole universe, which has, for example, a massive quantum wave function. If you combine that with the sort of the panpsychist spin on physics, then you think, well, maybe the universe as a whole should be regarded as a giant conscious subject. That's cosmopsychism. But now you've got the reverse of the combination problem, which I think, what you call the differentiation problem, or you might call it the decomposition problem. How do you get from one giant conscious subject, the universe as a whole, to the kinds of specific and bounded and separate subjects, which are you and me and so on? And to me that seems almost as hard as the combination problem. Although I know some people have somehow put forward the view, maybe we're all just little aspects of this giant mind and we're all actually part of a single unified subject, and it's very easy to, maybe this works better if you're on drugs, but it's I think it's very much a view worth exploring.
So maybe, I mean, am I correct in saying that if we assume some panpsychist view of the universe and the idea that there's some form of consciousness that is sort of, there's a universal property, right? That, is it correct to assume that precedes biological evolution? This is the thing I'm trying to wrap my arms around. In other words, how does that...
I think that would tend to be the view, yeah. If insofar as panpsychism is present at the very fundamental level of physics, and then, physics was around for a long time before there was any biological evolution on the standard view, Just on the panpsychist view, there was consciousness at the Big Bang, or just after the Big Bang. Presumably that preceded biological evolution, unless, there are these evolutionary views of physics where this Big Bang was just the latest in an evolutionary chain. But setting those speculations aside, then I think the panpsychist view is that, in fact, there's consciousness prior to biological evolution, just as there's matter prior to biological evolution. Yeah.
So I'm just trying to wrap my head around this. Is there that much evidence or empirical evidence for panpsychism? I'm not sure if there is or isn't. It doesn't sound like there is a lot.
There's not direct evidence, let's say. This is my view. There's not direct evidence for it.
So is it more that this is an idea that is around because it's predicted by models in different forms over the years?
I mean, one way to say it, in a very broad sense, yes, it's predicted by philosophical models, by some philosophical models, and it's predicted by some scientific models. So I think for many people here, the central interest of panpsychism is the way it ends up being, or something like it ends up being predicted by empirical models like IIT, Integrated Information Theory, which I guess were developed, to explain, they started off to explain the data about consciousness we do have, which come in the first place from human subjective experience, the first person case, and the reports of others. That gives us a lot of data. Yeah, we try and model those data with the simple and powerful principles, and then those principles end up having consequences. So I think that's how it's working right now on the scientific side. And even on the philosophical side, these arguments I was giving, like the argument from intrinsic natures, you can view that as a kind of philosophical model, if you like, of what's going on in physics. Here's an attractive model of the universe. It has panpsychism as a consequence. So those are, I suppose, indirect chains of reasoning that get you to panpsychism. If there's a direct chain of reasoning that gets you there, I haven't come across a good one yet.
So if we never find evidence for it, at some point you have to question models then? Or?
Well, the trouble is, of course, with theories of consciousness, with subjective experiences, that really direct evidence for them is kind of hard to find. Except, we've got this direct data of experience and reports from others and so on, but of course we don't have immediate measurements of consciousness, especially in non-human systems. It's often not a matter of direct evidence. It's always a matter of fitting together all the evidence you have and seeing what theories they lead you to, and so on. It would be really nice to have the consciousness meter where we can just wave over these systems directly and falsify. Your theory predicts that flies are conscious? Sorry, I just measured. I just waved the consciousness meter at the fly, it says no consciousness, so you're wrong. But it doesn't work that way, it seems, in the theory of consciousness. So the evidential situation is a bit more difficult here.
Yeah. I'm a bit surprised that you said that the combination problem is the most difficult problem in panpsychism, because, for example, IIT is directly actually addressing that problem, right? How to construct.
It's an interesting question. Is it on IIT, do you get the consciousness of the whole from the consciousness of the parts? IIT doesn't exactly look like that to me. It looks like it gives you a principle, for example, of taking a system as a whole, looking at its structure, and then say, here's the principle for when you've got a system with that kind of complex causal structure, it will have this kind of consciousness. So it's got something, one way to understand IIT, I don't want to say it's the only way, is as a dualist framework, where you take a physical structure of a certain kind, you say, okay, that physical structure is a certain causal structure, and it's a fundamental law. When you have that causal structure of a certain kind, you get consciousness of a certain kind. That's great, but it's not exactly getting the consciousness of the whole from the consciousness of the parts. It's getting the consciousness of the whole from the structure of the whole, which is different. Now, I'm sure maybe there are ways of thinking about IIT where somehow this connects to consciousness at a basic level, and Giulio likes to say that consciousness is integrated information, and that's all that's fundamental. But prima facie, I haven't yet seen how to understand IIT, so that one way to think about the wire for IIT is that integrated information, as you would normally think about it, is a non-fundamental quantity. It arises in complex systems, and there's an equation for it, and so on. At the very fundamental level of nature, there isn't any integrated information. One-unit systems don't have any integrated information. So you don't get the integrated information of the whole. If that's the case, you don't get the consciousness of the whole for putting together the consciousness of each individual part, because there is no consciousness of each individual part. So it's more holistic somehow.
Yeah, in a sense it's holistic, and that's why I asked whether you view IIT as a pan-proto-psychism or pan-psychism. Right? Individual unit doesn't have this integrated information, but IIT offers how to consider these things are interacting or produces something that was not there before. Minimum conscious system is like only 2 units of sense, interaction between them with feedback loop and things like that. But that kind of formulation is really an effort to think about how the things get combined from minimal system. So I thought it is actually offering a solution to this combination problem in a sense. That's why
I mean, if it's somehow grounding consciousness in properties of the parts, including the relations between the parts and some fundamental principles, then yeah, it's doing that. The question is whether, the question is what is playing the fundamental causal roles at the bottom level. And you might think, well, that's just, the causal powers of the whole come from the causal powers of the parts. Then the question is, does the whole have any new and autonomous causal powers, which is the role for consciousness to play? I know Julia has some really interesting views about this. I think he'll probably talk about that tomorrow, so maybe we'll get into that more then.
I think.
Sorry. You have one.
Given the difficulties of talking about entities, small entities, as having consciousness, or needing to add up microphysical entities to make a larger consciousness, does it make sense to look at a process philosophy view of this subject and talk about the structure of experience and the subject as arising out of each moment of experience?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think one thing that the process philosophy, which is, Whitehead, for example, was one of the great panpsychists of the 20th century, and his was a process philosophy. Somehow this deflates the subject, right? It's like, we shouldn't be thinking about all these atomic subjects. In fact, there's just this big process at the bottom level, and experience is part of a process. Maybe this helps deflate some of the problems that worried William James about how these separate subjects would come together to yield a new subject. I still want to somehow get an answer to the question of how do the fundamental, at the level of processes, how do the fundamental processes at the bottom level, the processes in which electrons or quarks are involved, which I presume on Whitehead's view will have some experiential qualities. So there'll be experiential processes for an electron here and a quark there. How do those processes come together to yield the processes that we have in human consciousness?
Right.
That still seems like a pretty hard question.
That kind of ties into that first question I was asked, because I believe from Whitehead's view, because each moment of experiences encompasses all previous moments into one unity to begin with, because you have everything there to start with, it's more, you don't have to combine it, it's all there already.
I see. Everything was already there. Every possible experience was there in the Big Bang. Is that somehow the idea?
I believe that.
And we somehow gets differentiated across time?
No, I don't think so.
No?
I think every new moment of experience takes all the existing ones, brings them together into one unity, and then creates a new experience.
I see. Then that seems though potentially to pose the combination problem right there. Right? How do these pre-existing experiences come together to form a new one? Another issue here is the issue of diachronic combination across time. How do two old systems come together to form a new and bigger system? Which is one aspect of the combination problem, but you might think panpsychism is also committed to synchronic combination. The underlying, right now, there are atoms and electrons in my brain with little experiences that somehow come together to form the experiences that I'm having right now. People call that synchronic combination at a time. And maybe this Whitehead story would help with combination across time, but I still worry about combination at a time. But I need to find out more about Whitehead, because I'm not any kind of expert on his view. Thanks. Yeah?
Just a follow-up on the combination problem, actually. When we, for example, replace the word, let's say, just for the sake of discussion, consciousness with function or anything. And if you look at biological systems and we replace consciousness with function, we can see lots of examples and models and so on, which kind of propose a way to an alternative for the combination problem. For example, like in morphogenesis, you have single cells and they come together and you rise their new function, which relates a little bit like to emergence. So then, I don't know if it still makes sense if we assume, let's replace function back with consciousness and assume that each of them has certain subjective experiences and they, a biological system evolved to give rise to a new property which is emerging that could maybe provide a solution or at least an alternative explanation for the, or do you think is there any does it make any sense to follow that one?
So for functions, I think we do have a pretty good grip on how it is that small functions can come together to yield big functions, how it is one particle affecting another particle. Put together enough of this might build together a molecule, which could now play a new, more complex causal role for other molecules, and eventually give you stuff at the level of molecular biology, and so on. Maybe one way to think about the combination problem is that's great for functions, but when it comes to consciousness, we're thinking about not just about functions, but about this particular intrinsic subjective character. And what we need is a way to do that for subjective character. We don't have a model yet for that that shows how the two different subjective experiences could come together to yield a big subjective experience. Now, if we reconstrued subjective experience just as a function, I think Jakob was saying, just as integration, then we can see how a little bit of integration maybe could come together to yield, in the right structure, to yield a lot of integration. At least my attitude would be that when it comes to consciousness, that would still be on the objective side, the side of the easy problems. And it doesn't yet give a theory of how this would work for subjectivity or for experience. But maybe that could be a way of extending the model so it works there. Maybe that's part of your thought.
I mean, not necessarily coming from objective to subjective, but the other way around. So from subjective, because of the behavior and the interaction between different units, it can give rise to another level of the same or of objectivity or subjectivity. I mean,
because of the behavior, you get the subjectivity somehow from the behavior?
You can't go back, you can't explain subjectivity using this type of models.
Mm-hmm.
You assume that each of them had subjectivity, then you may reach a level of objectivity, and there you may assign another level of subjectivity again, and so on.
I sort of see the attraction. You've got these bits of proto-subjectivity in the context of the right kind of structure and function. This will give you a macro subjectivity. I mean, I like the basic picture, but I guess the question is, how does this actually work? How do you actually get this to, are there somehow principles by which micro-subjects in the context of macro function give you a macro-subject? Maybe IoT or maybe some theory could actually do that. But my worry is, doing that without having it fall into a new form of emergent panpsychism is pretty hard work, I think. But, maybe it can be done. Yeah, you're right.
I think I understand the arguments for panpsychism. I sympathize to some extent, but I think this, to me, it's one big problem that they didn't mention, and that is all this is made to explain a phenomenon that we have just one example of from our own consciousness, and that's a very special example that we try to extrapolate everything from into the rest of nature, and that's the most complex unit that we know, our range, right? So I think it's extremely dangerous to extrapolate from that single example and assume that there has to be a intrinsic nature in the rest of the universe. So, so that I think that's the one main reason for my skepticism towards panpsychism. Also, the other thing is that our brains are made to sort of think about the minds, other people's minds, our own mind, with a very special system inside our brain, so we are very prone to I think, illusions in that area. Thinking about our brains are not made to understand this kind of thing, I think.
Yeah. I mean, of course, it's a really difficult issue for the science of consciousness in general, that direct primary data are so hard to come by. And if viewed as if you've got very high standards for what counts as primary data, then we only have it in the first-person case. But I think you can be a little bit more liberal. We certainly have an awful lot of data about other people's consciousness from their verbal reports. And I think, taking the attitude that verbal reports are actually accurate reports, unless there's reason to believe otherwise, then you've got a lot more data to get a science of consciousness off the ground. In a way, I mean, you could raise the same objection to theories of the physical world. Say, plenty of people, Descartes, Berkeley, and so we don't have direct evidence about the physical world. All we have is the data of our experience. So someone would say, actually, from this perspective, consciousness looks better off than physics. We have one data point for consciousness, we've got no data point for physics. But what do? Well, we take it that our perception is, in fact, an accurate guide to external reality, unless there's reason to believe otherwise. You can never defeat the skeptic who says maybe none of this really exists. But I think to do science, to get science off the ground, what we do is we make the assumption that perception is by and large telling you about reality, and you get illusions when there's conflict and so on, and then you have to mistrust perception. But then we can get a science of physics off the ground. That's roughly my attitude towards the science of consciousness. Yeah, I can't prove that, just as I can't refute the skeptic about the external world, I can't prove that you're conscious. And I can't refute the hypothesis that everyone else is a zombie, but nonetheless, I think verbal reports play the same role that perception does. in getting as a guide to the physical world. That gives us a lot more data. Now we're still going to have the problem that verbal reports are pretty limited to the human case, and that extending beyond the human case still leaves us with a whole lot of slack in our data. On the other hand, at least now we're going to be left with a fair amount of data to get a fairly rich and powerful theory off the ground. And we've moved beyond one data point. Yeah, Dave.
So empirical data about the actual existence of consciousness is hard to come by, but one thing we do have empirical data on is the way people make attributions of mind. One thing we know about that is that there are qualitatively different or statistically independent components that go into that. For example, attribution of capacity for experience is independent of agency. They can come together, they can go separately. And it seems like all the discussion of consciousness in a panpsychist context seems to be a consciousness that offers a single dimension. I'm just wondering if there's any room for such qualitative distinctions and perhaps different rates at which each of these qualitatively different dimensions might arise.
Yeah, well, this is somehow tied to that quality combination problem that I mentioned. The human consciousness is extremely rich and qualitatively variegated, and there's all the different sensory modalities, just for a start, and then there's cognitive phenomenology, consciousness of thought, there's agency, as you said, there's the experience of agency. These are many, many different directions of what it is to be a humanly conscious subject. So one way to raise the question is, does that differentiation apply at the fundamental panpsychic level? Well, it's kind of hard to see how there's going to be room for all those distinctions at the panpsychic level, because we're dealing with such simple systems, The electron only has these 7 basic properties or something. So the alternative view is there's some kind of, basic building blocks of consciousness, which will somehow yield all these differentiated human qualities as phenomena of complexity at a higher level. Maybe 7 basic building blocks of consciousness that come together to yield vision somehow, and audition somehow, and agency somehow, and cognition somehow. And if you ask me how does that work, I have absolutely no idea. And it's incredibly hard to see how it can work, and that's just an aspect of what I'm calling the quality combination problem. But if you've got a view about how to make this work in a panpsychist context, I'd love to hear it.
May I ask you a question related to this question? I'm a visual neuroscientist, I'm not a philosopher, but from this point of view of panpsychism, in my view, consciousness is about someone perceiving something. So how could, for example, an animal without photoreceptors be conscious of color or light? And how could anything without specific receptors, for example, in the case of sensory perception, be conscious of something that doesn't have any receptors for it? How does it feel, radiation? For us, it doesn't feel like anything.
Yeah. Well, couple things. One, of course, there is such a thing as hallucination and so on, consciousness without an external stimulus. Hallucination.
Yeah, but of something that you have previously perceived.
Okay, this is controversial.
Or you can imagine. Can you imagine gamma rays?
Yeah.
How do they feel like?
Yeah. But sorry, anyway, how does this apply to panpsychism? I think the worry is, how could electrons be conscious of something without corresponding sensory organs for it? Well, I suppose one way that a panpsychist might think of it is that electrons are not autonomous systems. They do receive input from the environment. They're affected by other electrons and protons and so on, and charge interactions. And if you wanted to view this through the lens of perception, I'm not sure it's the right lens. Who's to say that perception is exactly the right word to apply at a fundamental level? But at least there's interaction. They are getting signals from the outside. And maybe whatever qualities of consciousness we end up ascribing to an electron will correspond pretty directly to the way they're processing information. They're getting signals from the outside. So if you wanted to tie consciousness to sensory input, I think probably the panpsychist would find a way to do that. So you can.
I was remembering now this graph at the beginning where you had the sleep, dying, cerebellum, liver, and then I remember what cells, and all this. And I was thinking that one empirical way to work this would be maybe to be anesthetized very slowly or locally here and there, inactivating pieces of the brain, or a very slow anesthesia, but it cannot be slow actually, as a matter of fact, the general anesthesia, for some reason the brain works, but if you could do it really slowly, and if you had the measure, the proper one, if you apply, then with your own experience changing, as long as you can, tell the story afterwards, because probably at some point, you might have an experience, you cannot tell the story, but you remember it, and maybe when you wake up, you can tell the story, and go into the minimal possible human experience. I don't know what it is. We don't experience it normally because it's non-linear the way we go into sleep or anesthesia. I think it's because some neurophysiology, it's just because of neurophysiology. But you might find ways to inactivate, bit by bit, or separate parts of the brain and see what happens. It's not so.
So the thought is we can try and find minimal levels of consciousness by getting at minimal levels of human consciousness, deactivate into the brain a bit at a time, go very gradually into sleep or anesthesia.
An idea how I feel to have, I don't know, a billion bytes of file.
Yeah.
Where it is, what it feels like being there, or if you had a measure, the good one, right?
Yeah. I do think this kind of method's got a really crucial role to play in the science of consciousness, trying to get down to the various minimal conditions, at least in us, and seeing how our consciousness co-varies. At the same time, I think we're probably going to need to distinguish minimal conditions from human consciousness from minimal conditions for consciousness. Maybe that for consciousness of human, it's always going to require some kind of extreme complexity, because we, by our nature, are these very complex integrated systems, and some much simpler kind of consciousness may be required for consciousness in a being.
When I'm in general anesthesia, and I don't exist, but I did it myself, then, let's say, this is particular for human, where it's no consciousness. I mean, see what I mean? Is it something that if I find the same number of, X in myself when I'm in that state, and then I find the same number in another structure, can I infer that that structure is,
Well, only if we knew that X was a perfect measure of consciousness, and if we just determined that in you, X, this degree of X gave you unconsciousness, then presumably X in another system would give you unconsciousness. But I think again we need to distinguish measures of consciousness within the context of a human system from more general universal measures. I mean, it's possible that, for example, if you're a panpsychist, presumably you'll think that when a human becomes unconscious, say under anesthesia, there are still many conscious systems in the brain. Maybe, for example, individual cells could be conscious, or at least individual particles could be conscious. Maybe even, these little brain areas which are still pretty active when you're asleep. The dream maybe the dream spinner suddenly becomes conscious now because who's to say? So I think one has to start making a lot of distinctions between the consciousness of the global complex system and the consciousness of the parts. Giulio has a particular view about this involving the exclusion postulate, where only one of these can be conscious at a time, but other panpsychists would allow that you could have consciousness at multiple levels simultaneously.
Okay, so thanks, David, for the question. So, if you want to go to the restroom, please go, because it's going to be an hour of drive, I guess. And then when we arrive at the hotel, we'll have a barbecue dinner at the hotel.